Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. For over 6 decades, J. Patrick White has made Iowa City his home. A graduate of City High, a BBA in Business Administration from the University of Iowa, and a JD Law degree with distinction from Iowa, Mr. White has led a full and distinguished career in law and in government. He served 2 terms on the Iowa City Council, the youngest person ever elected at that time, a member of the Johnson County Planning Commission, the East Central Iowa Crime Commission, East Central Iowa Council of Governments, and was president of the Iowa Association of Regional Councils. Serving as the first assistant Johnson County attorney in 1975, he was elected Johnson County attorney in 1982 and has served in this capacity ever since. He will retire in January of 2007. Mr. White has received numerous awards for his work. In 1989, he was named Iowa's Outstanding Public Official by the Iowa Corrections Association. J. Patrick White was a judge advocate in the U.S. Air Force and received 3 special awards during his service. In addition to his busy career, Mr. White coached Little League and Babe Ruth baseball, was a member of the Iowa City Jaycees, winning a Distinguished Service Award from the Jaycees. He served on Mercy Hospital Foundation Board, president of the Johnson County Bar Association, and in 1995, an inductee into the Iowa City High School Hall of Fame. He is a recipient of the Johnson County Coalition Against Domestic Violence Vision Award. Pat and his wife Betty raised 2 daughters in Iowa City, Jennifer and Megan. Welcome to One of a Kind. Your story, I know, begins in August of 1940 in Des Moines. And
yes.
A year later, you moved to Iowa City.
Yeah, more accurately, my parents
Your
did.
parents did.
My father was born and raised in Iowa City, and after law school, he took a job with the State Department of Social Services in Des Moines, where he met my mother, who was born and raised in Granger, which is a small community northwest of Des Moines. So I was born there, and when I was approximately a year old, they decided to return to Iowa City, and I've been here ever since, except for the 3 years I spent away in the Air Force.
Now, when you were growing up, you told me before the interview, your parents were very involved in politics.
Yeah.
When you were at City High and...
Well, my father served 3 terms as county attorney. In those days, it was a 2-year term, and he was the Johnson County attorney from 1944 through 1950. Served as the Democratic Central Committee chairman, ran for the Iowa State Senate. By that time, I was in high school. And my mother, as in those days women tended to do, spent a lot of time with Democratic Party organization and eventually became the secretary of the State Central Committee, where my memory is that she spent a lot of time recruiting, attempting to recruit candidates for the Iowa legislature. And so I learned at a very early age putting posters on telephone poles and leafleting indoors. And actually, my paternal grandfather was also an elected official. He was the elected Iowa City assessor for close to 40 years. The position then was an elected official, and my paternal great uncle, my grandmother's brother, was the elected county auditor for quite some time until his death. So politics was a very natural both avocation and vocation. In my
couldn't
family.
do much else,
No.
could you? You thought about doing something else.
I did.
Uh-huh.
Probably when I was in high school, I had some reservations about the time that I saw this consuming on my parents' part. I saw how it, particularly if they were not successful in recruiting a candidate or not successful in an election, how it weighed on them. And for a short while, I came to believe that I wasn't much interested in politics. I think that changed pretty permanently and pretty dramatically in 1959 when I met Jack Kennedy, who was then campaigning for president, and certainly, like a lot of others my age, influenced to look to public sector work and to whether you could make your corner of the world, and maybe even larger than your corner of the world, a better place. My parents were very active in his campaign in the early stages of organization, and I actually met him in 1959 when he came to an Iowa Notre Dame football game and gave a speech Saturday morning in what was then the Jefferson Hotel, and then later that morning in the main lounge of the Iowa Memorial Union. And so I think I've been led to a public life by some of his ideals.
When you went into law school after graduating in business administration, were you very political in law school? I know you were on the Iowa Law Review, the comments editor. Was that fun?
Oh, it was just an absolute delight. And no, at that time I probably wasn't politically active. I was politically interested, but law school is so consuming in terms of time and energy, and the Law Review itself was so consuming. For example, we'd at Law Review Deadline, which is, Law Review is a publication that we edited, there were 7 of us, we'd go 2 or 3 days without sleep. And we worked very hard. We had keys to the library. We were there till 2 or 3 most mornings, and there just wasn't time for much outside of law school. But I followed it and certainly had an interest.
So after law school, we might have time to get back maybe for the few stories about Dean Ladd and some of your experiences there. You went into the Air Force. Was this an important part of your story?
It was. It's an important part for a variety of reasons. First of all, in the context, we were at the height of the Vietnamese conflict. We still had a draft. I was single, healthy, 1A, but affirmatively wanted to discharge my military obligation. And that was just part of my value system, my belief that all of us, those of us who were able, owed it to our country to do what we could. So I joined the Air Force, albeit as a judge advocate, seeking to utilize my then law degree and law training. And my permanent duty station was Wurtsmith Air Force Base, which is about 200 miles north of Detroit. It was a strategic air command, fairly high alert B-52 base. And that was my first exposure to prosecution. Fairly quickly in my tenure there, they assigned me to be the permanent base prosecutor. And that's actually how I got started with what I do today.
And did you think that this would be your path, being a prosecutor?
I really didn't know, and by the time I left the Air Force, I was fairly sure it would not be. I succumbed in that era, at that very young age in my career, to what I think a lot of young prosecutors succumb to, which is you lose sight of your responsibility to do justice. I was 2-3 years out of law school, began to measure my success, as did others, by whether I won every case, which I did. But not only that, whether I got the maximum sentence that was available. And people who were around or near me, or my wife Betty will tell you that I sent a lot of very young men to Fort Leavenworth for 5 years for smoking a joint. Now, in defense of that, it was a high-security SAC installation that wasn't at all tolerant to any drug use, but with the benefit of hindsight, I was too severe on a lot of those kids, and I didn't fully understand my responsibility not to win every case, but to seek justice in every case. And so when I left the Air Force, chose to come back here to go into private practice, I doubted very much that I would return to prosecution.
During the Air Force time, another important part is that you met your wife, Betty.
I did.
You did. Is there a story in that?
Well, I had been at Wirtsmith Air Force Base for about a year. I was doing a 3-year Air Force term, and almost all of us who were single spent a lot of evenings at the Officers Club after work, watching television, eating, and about a year into my tour there, we had heard word that 2 new nurses had been assigned to Wirtsmith Air Force Base, so the young male officers there were intrigued to see who was going to show up, and indeed one night while a bunch of us were sitting around a table having dinner at the Officers Club, Betty and her best friend, both of whom came from Hoboken, New Jersey, walked in. It was still probably a few months before we were introduced in any serious way or began to see each other. But then we ended up getting married. In fact, when we decided to get married, we decided that the vast majority of our friends, the people who knew both of us, were at Wirtsmith Air Force Base. So instead of in her hometown of Hoboken, New Jersey, or back here in Iowa City, we actually got married in Michigan at Wirtsmith Air Force Base in a traditional military cross swords type of wedding.
What did her friends think about her moving to Iowa?
Well, Iowa is still, I think, not well known by people on the East Coast, and so they were a little leery, assumed she was marrying somebody who farmed, and in fact, that was underscored one day in the, I think the second summer after we were here. We had bought our first house, on a little house on Crestview out in East Iowa City. And we had 3 or 4 tomato plants, and she was out in back picking some tomatoes. I called her in to take a phone call from one of her friends who was just mortified, assumed that she had been living on some farm and didn't have any running water or facilities, and that I had her out in the field harvesting the crops. And of course she
was out picking tomatoes.
Right. She's very much the city girl, having grown up in Hoboken right across from Manhattan.
Well, we're glad she joined you here.
Well,
we're
so am I.
Yes, I'm sure you are. So you were in private practice, and what made you run for the Iowa City Council at the tender age of 29?
29, right.
Yeah.
In fact, I just turned 29 in August of 1969. I actually began to organize a race for the city council, excuse me, a little before that when I was still 28. Well, I got back to town, got active in the Iowa City JCs. At that time, urban renewal was the local topic. It was hotly debated. There was a fair amount of dissatisfaction with some of the city council. And the friends I made in the JCs quickly sensed my interest in politics, encouraged me to take a look at running against 2 incumbents who were then on the city council, volunteered and helped starting to organize. And my interest in politics combined with my interest in government and the fact that it was a part-time position that I could do and maintain my private practice quickly led me to say I wanted to do that. It was a very tangible, very immediate way for me to try to make a difference in my hometown.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh, I loved it.
Did you love it?
Absolutely loved it. The campaign that we engaged in, and I say we because it was certainly a collaborative effort, from July or August through the election in November, where I knocked on as many doors as time would permit, had press releases, had forums, is still to this day the most fun I had in political or elective office.
It was good that you had
It was just a kick.
law practice that you had some flexibility.
Well, of course, I was a young lawyer with probably fewer clients than ideally you'd like to have at that time, and so some time available to do it.
So what was the transition from your law practice into maybe thinking about being a Johnson County attorney?
Well, it was unexpected, unplanned, and took some time. I had run for and was reelected to the city council in 1973. The Jack Dooley, who I was then sharing office space with, practicing in downtown Iowa City, ran for Johnson County Attorney in 1974, and he won a three-way primary in June of that year. And after he was officially elected in November, one day I looked up from my desk and he was standing in my doorway, 5:15, 5:30 someday, and he said, well, so now that I'm going to have this job as county attorney, is there any chance you'd consider coming with me to do the county's civil work? Which he and I literally had not discussed. I'd not contemplated that at all, but I agreed to think about it, and upon reflection, it was an even more ideal merger for me of politics, government, and the law, in that it would give me an opportunity to practice my vocation, which was being a lawyer, as the primary civil lawyer for county government, and allow me to stay active in politics because I was the first assistant to an elected official. So that was the first step in the transition, which lasted 8 years. I still didn't contemplate becoming county attorney. In fact, during that 8-year tenure as first assistant, I thought about doing other things in electoral politics, but not becoming county attorney. And then in probably 1981, 1982, Jack Dooley began to say he wasn't sure that he was up to running again. He was beginning to experience some health problems, and suggested that I think about it. And again, that came as something that was unplanned. But once again, I made the decision that it was a continuation of the combination of law, government, and politics, so I chose to run. But even in 1982, when I did that, I never dreamed I'd still be there. I envisioned that I was going to stay involved in government and politics, but I envisioned someday I would run for Congress or Attorney General or I don't know what else. And actually looked at a couple other things on occasions. But I never found anything that was as satisfying as working in the county attorney's office, the opportunities it gave me to have an impact even outside of Johnson County, and continuing to combine my three loves, three vocational loves of law, politics, and government.
Well, we're glad you did. We're glad you stayed, but I want to know, looking at these 24 years, soon to be 24 years, what are the cases that have given you the greatest greatest satisfaction and perhaps have been were the most difficult for you?
You know, it's hard to pick a case or cases, and I don't mean to make this comparison, but it's a little like being asked to name your favorite child among several children.
Okay.
It's obviously a very different context. Some of the things that stand out, though, would be the Mayberry murder case, which culminated with in 1985 with the first-degree murder conviction in Johnson County in close to 50 years. Throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, Johnson County had developed something of a reputation statewide as a place that returned strange verdicts, that people could do things and get away with them here because juries were more receptive to some defense theories and convicted not as frequently as the rest of the state. So the Mayberry murder conviction, being the first degree conviction in nearly 50 years, was a real milestone for me.
What was the Mayberry, for people who are new to the community?
James Mayberry was charged with murdering a young woman by the name of Julia Wise, who had just come here from Springfield, Missouri, and was living in the Hilltop Trailer Court. Other murder cases stand out. The Memmer murder case from a few years ago, in terms of number of witnesses and exhibits. I'm not going to be precise on this, but
Sure.
I think on the list of witnesses that I ended up with, I had something like 110 people and actually called close to 70 and introduced close to 150 exhibits. So in terms of sheer management, that stands out as a high watermark. And obviously we were pleased to get the conviction. There are other smaller cases that don't draw a lot of attention. Any sex abuse, any domestic abuse, those are usually pretty rewarding.
And you've got a wonderful award from the domestic violence. So
I did.
That's an area you've kind of concentrated on?
Well, I would say there are a handful of things that I set out to do when I was first elected in 1982. And one of them was professionalize the office, but a spin-off of that was emphasize operating while intoxicated, emphasize domestic abuse, emphasize sex abuse, and turn things around in terms of the perception that Johnson County had developed about murder cases. So I think it would be fair to say that we've emphasized OWIs and domestics and sex abuse. In the area of domestic abuse, for example, but I should emphasize it's not just me, it's a real collaborative effort. Mandatory arrest began in Iowa on July 1 of 1986, and prior to that, we had developed a coalition among the Domestic Violence Project with Pat Meyer, the Department of Corrections with Steve Street, Department of Human Services, which was then headed by Carol Thompson and others, Steve Treves, who was with the Community Mental Health Center, trying to develop an approach to domestic abuse that actually led to our implementing in Johnson County a batterers education program before it became a legislative requirement. I think we were catalysts in many respects for what became a statewide requirement. And I would like to think that some of the attitudes and policy approaches that we used here for OWI, for domestic abuse, for sex abuse, and probably a broader area, which I would refer to as victims' cases or victims' rights. I think many of those we were able to spread the word, get people to look at more seriously statewide, legislators and other prosecutors. And as an example, the Mayberry murder case, which I've cited as the first degree conviction here in nearly 50 years, also is a landmark for one other fairly important issue, and that is wrongful death restitution. As I started to prepare for sentencing in that case, I kept looking at this statute that said, and the defendant shall be ordered to pay restitution, including wrongful death restitution. I couldn't find any case where that had ever been done, and I asked around my colleagues, the Attorney General's office, and everybody said, well, that language has been there since 1978, but we don't know of anybody who's ever used it. Well, as part of the sentencing, I retained an individual to attempt to value Julia Wise's life and then submit at the sentencing a statement of pecuniary damages or wrongful death damages. Judge Vern Robinson awarded wrongful death damages as part of his sentence, and naturally it was challenged since it was a case of first impression, but the Iowa Supreme Court upheld it. Most of my colleagues, the other county attorneys who I got along with, but they gave me a very bad time about that, saying, Pat, we don't have time to do this. Why didn't you just keep quiet about this? Why didn't you just let it continue to go unattended? Well, instead, what happened was in a few years, the Iowa legislature, aware of the fact that we had done it and that wasn't being done statewide, adopted a statute that made $150,000 as a mandatory or automatic wrongful death damage amount so that prosecutors didn't have to go to all the work that we had gone to in that first wrongful death case.
So it's a state law now.
It is become a state law.
Because of this case
Every
and your
time
work.
someone dies, murder or vehicular homicide, the defendant at sentencing is now ordered to pay $150,000 to the estate of the decedent. Now, as a practical matter, oftentimes they're not able to pay
They
that.
don't have the money.
But one of the things that I've said is I've encouraged others to do this and encouraged the legislature to do it, is that if you sentence someone to life in prison and they have to work to pay that judgment off, every day they're at work, they're going to remember why they're there. Mm-hmm. They're going to remember that they've been sentenced for taking someone else's life. And even if the amount is small, the family, the survivors, are going to take some solace from that.
That is
So I feel very good about that.
very good about that. Another thing you were involved in, I read that you served on the Correction System Review Task Force and led to reform in truth in sentencing. For the layperson, what does that mean?
Well, what it means is that in Iowa we have an indeterminate sentencing system. And even most reporters who cover the system and report that someone was sentenced to a term of 10 years don't understand that Iowa has an indeterminate system which is going to parole that person sooner. There's a statutory provision that credits them for what's called good and honor time, although the legislature has changed that slightly. But the effect is, if you go to prison on a 10-year sentence, you almost automatically earn a reduction of that sentence by half just for behaving. And then the Iowa Parole Board has discretion to parole you whenever they think you've satisfied the goals of a prison sentence and can safely be returned to society. So it's not uncommon for people who are sentenced to 5 years to be paroled in a year and a half. It's not uncommon for people who are sentenced to 10-year terms to be paroled in 2.5, 3.5 years. And so my quest, legislative quest, which is still not successful, we've had some success but not nearly as much as we need yet, is that we need to get to a system where a judge says what he or she means and the system means what the judge has said, rather than telling people that it's a 10-year sentence and the person gets out in 2 or 3. Well, one of the small legislative successes is the judge now says from the bench that even though I've sentenced this person to 10 years, they may be credited with a reduction and they may get out earlier. So we now, at least at sentencings, have them acknowledging that this system exists after sentencing.
So it's evolving. We're not,
is.
okay. I read also that you have tried cases in front of the Supreme Court and the Iowa Court of Appeals 23 times and you've never lost. Is that
I think 23 is...
23?
I think right. It would include cases in Iowa. The Attorney General by statute handles criminal appeals. But in cases where I've been the trial counsel or the appellate council, which would be largely civil matters. I think it's now 23 times they've gone to the Iowa Supreme Court or the Iowa Court of Appeals to a published opinion, and I've never lost. Now, some critics would say, well, Pat, you must not be handling tough cases, but I don't think that's
I don't think
the
so.
case.
Not if you. I don't think that's the case. I think that's quite remarkable. Quite remarkable. I want to ask you. I always ask my guests this question about looking back in your very, very full career. Who's had a influence on you? What is there? Some people, teachers along the way, or who or what has had a major influence on you?
Well, my parents, of course, did. Being as politically active as they were and being involved in government as they were, they certainly had a great influence. In fact, their influence included encouraging me to go to law school. I don't know whether I would have made that decision, but for their fairly incessant suggestion that it would be a good thing for me to do. Political figures like Jack Kennedy certainly had an influence on me. Probably lots of my teachers, even going back to grade school. My elementary school principal at Longfellow, Don Seavey, this was from the mid-40s when I started in kindergarten there through the very early 50s when I left. He picked me to be the captain of the school patrol, which even then gave me
the die was cast.
Yeah, gave me a sense of responsibility. I think my law school teachers probably had the greatest impact on my thought process and view of societal responsibility. Well, it would include people like Sandy Boyd, who's still around today, Alan Vestal, who was the law professor in the very first class I went to in law school and scared the bejeebers out of me and most of my classmates, but he was a wonderful teacher.
You mean he was so tough?
Well, he had this system. He had very high expectations. And he had a system that we called his team, where my class was approximately 160 people, but all semester he would only call on 10 or 12 of us. And if you were called on the first day, that meant you were likely to get called on every day that the class met. And so you had darn well be prepared. You didn't have any slack. And I think that taught those of us who were on the team, it certainly taught us discipline and preparedness, and substantively he was a very good teacher as well. And both he and Sandy had a clear sense of societal responsibility for a lawyer, that your education should be used for more than just advancing the cause of a client, but for trying to do something for your community. In fact, Sandy is remarkable, and in fact still is doing that with his current work on nonprofits. And the law school was small enough that you developed a personal relationship with them. Dean Ladd was another figure who felt the same way about a lawyer's responsibility to the school, the law school that he or she came out of, and society as well. He was a wonderful human being and a wonderful leader.
Was he a character?
Oh,
I've heard
yeah.
so much about
very much
his
so.
name.
And all of us who were in law school when Dean Ladd was there kidded about him behind his back. His speaking mannerism, he walked with the use of two canes. I mean, he was remarkable in the way he dealt with the physical affliction that he had. His mobility was terrific. But we loved him a lot. He always called us, and he called every class this his boys. Now, in those days, my class had 2 women out of 160. It's pretty much equalized today, but the dean, meaning no gender slight at all, would call the graduates of the law school his boys, or the students, his boys, and he would always look out for us. I particularly still recall, and the 7 of us, you mentioned the Iowa Law Review earlier, there were 7 of us who were Law Review editors and worked just incredible hours. And we were approaching a deadline 1/4 of July, but we decided we owed ourselves a few hours break, and so we went out and bought some steak and some corn on the cob, and I think there's a possibility there might even have been a couple of beers in the basket and sacks we took upstairs. And we put a grill on the fireplace of our offices, and Lord only knows why, but the dean showed up. Well, we had the grill going.
He probably could smell the steaks.
We managed to keep him down a flight of steps, and he said he was just coming to check on his boys, that he figured we'd be working even though it was a holiday. That was so typical of it.
That is good. I've got to ask you, I don't know how you have any time for any hobbies with all the commitments you have, and but you've got, when you aren't working, what do you like to do? What are some of the things that speak to you?
Well, first of all, I think that is a learned, I won't say habit, but I think it's a learned necessity. With the benefit of hindsight, and I don't know if my oldest daughter has heard this or not. She's probably going to hear it when she sees this interview. I don't think I was as good as I should have been with my family for the first 8, 10, 12 years of her life as I probably was for the first 8, 10, 12 years of my second daughter's life. In that I clearly worked too hard. I was at the office every night except Saturday. Always on Sunday night. There was hardly a night during the week that I didn't go back to work until 10 or 11 or midnight. And I mean, I would still do that if I have a major trial. But one of the things I learned was that that's not really a recipe for long-term success. It's a recipe for early burnout. I'm a lifelong baseball fan. I've always loved sports. I was active in athletics when I was in high school. I was on the basketball team. I was much too small to play football, so I was the football manager. I started going to City High football practices when I was about 8 years old. I grew up in a house that was on Court Street, and you could see City High out my bedroom window. And before school started, I was up there when they were doing 2-a-day practices, hanging out and chasing footballs and helping them with anything I could. Certainly baseball. I played on the City High baseball team and have followed baseball all my life.
And your favorite team is?
Chicago White Sox. This is a terrific year for the White Sox. Up until probably early in September, they had the best record in baseball. And some people this year are asking trivia questions about when was the last time they won a postseason game. And I knew what the answer was because I was at the first game of the World Series in 1959 when they beat the Los Angeles Dodgers 11-0. And
lucky you.
so I knew it had been 56 years. I was there with my father, who was also a big White Sox fan. In fact, I grew up, at the time it was WCFL. It's now the same station, 1000 in Chicago. It's changed iterations, but you can barely hear it. You hear more static than you do broadcast, and it was pretty tough listening. And for both my mother and my 2 sisters, Sunday afternoons particularly were pretty staticky around our house. But that's how I got to be a White Sox fan. My father started taking me, I think, when I was 8 years old to see the White Sox. And
what a year for you this year.
It has been, yeah.
You got to go to be on the infield.
Well, this summer, I spent 2004 as the president of the State Association of Counties, which was a little bit strange for a county attorney, but nonetheless, I served in that capacity, and as a thank you, last January, they gave me this, what's called a White Sox fantasy experience, which was essentially premium parking, good seats for the ball game, but most importantly, an hour on the field while the White Sox are engaged in batting practice. So I got to meet several of them, including Jerry Reinsdorf, who's one of the owners, and had a very nice talk with him that afternoon. It was a great evening. I bet he didn't quite enjoy it as much as I did.
But she went.
She went.
She went. You mentioned your daughter Jennifer, and you have a second daughter, Megan. Tell me just briefly where they are and what they're doing.
I have Jennifer, both are graduates of City High. Jennifer now lives in New York, in Manhattan. She lives at about West 72nd Street. Her day job is with a headhunting firm. She recruits people, tries to place people in investment banking. But she moved to New York now probably 6, maybe 7 years ago to pursue what she wishes still to be her vocation, which is singing. She was a pretty talented singer. Of course, her father thinks she was terrific. At City High and then at the university, she was the soprano lead in all of the university operas the last 2 to 3 years that she was here.
Wonderful.
She sings with a couple choral groups in New York now, including one group that sings at Lincoln Center and Avery Fisher Hall. She's auditioned for the Metropolitan Opera. She actually was picked to be an understudy in a role and had a wonderful experience. It was a role an opera that Pavarotti was singing in, and she sang what's called a table rehearsal, meaning they're sitting around a table before they start to stage it. She sang a scene that he also sang in. He took a liking to her and invited her for a private coaching lesson, which was very professionally done and a real thrill for her.
That's
her mother and I are hoping to get there next spring to match up with one of her concert dates. Megan is a high school Spanish teacher at Southeast Polk outside of Des Moines. She married another school teacher 3 summers ago who's also he's a Coralville native. I started to say Iowa City, but he would probably prefer Coralville. He's a social studies teacher in the Ankeny school system at the junior high level. And so it's been quite a thrill for me to see my daughter and her husband devote themselves to educating kids. It really still is my belief in terms of public policy and investment of time that the single most important thing that a human being can do with their life to try to make our system better is to find a child who's at risk or needs help and touch that child in some way to help them. And school teaching is about the epitome of trying to do that from my perspective. So I'm pretty proud of both of them as well. She's expecting our first grandchild in January of 2006. So we're all pretty excited about that.
That's pretty, you'll love being a grandfather. I just know you will, and your wife too, being a grandmother. So my last question is, what made you decide not to run again?
It was a hard decision. I think it's the right time. When this term ends next year, I'll be 66. I had heart bypass surgery now 3 years ago. I had a quintuple bypass surgery, which was a real shock both to the physical system and the psyche. And I think it's fair to say that started the thought process about how I wanted to try to spend the last few years of my life. And as I thought about it, in spite of the fact that I still love what I do, I mean, it absolutely is a joy to me to drive up the hill beside the courthouse every day and to walk into that back door. But I wanted to free up some time to see more of my children, to spend more time with them. Jennifer being in New York, it's hard. We see each other, if we're lucky, once or twice a year, and that's really not often enough. It's very difficult for me to free up time as county attorney. want to spend a little more time in my garden. One of my avocations is gardening. I have lots of daylilies and hosta. In fact, last night, we're now on the 11th of October. Last night I actually got away from the office about 5:15, got home, had about 45 minutes of daylight to go weed a place I've got around some grass that had, ornamental grass that had been overgrown a little bit this summer. So I still want to do more of that. And I finally decided that I just want to do, I don't know what it'll be yet. I just want to do something different for the last few years of my life. My intention is to work. I'll probably spend some time in a volunteer capacity. I haven't gotten to what it's going to be or what form it's going to take.
Well, you're still working full-time,
Yeah,
so you just,
it'll be,
it'll evolve too.
I'll start to focus on it next year and
Yeah.
maybe the first few months after I'm out of office. But
I bet you many people don't know that you're a gardener. It must be very relaxing after
is.
your stressful job. That's
it is. It's the closest thing that I have to an escape. But it's also fairly contemplative, so that if you're trying to make a decision or you're trying to evaluate something, there's lots of tasks in the garden that are fairly mindless, that you can think about something else while you're at it.
Well, I just will be interested to see what your next chapter will hold for you. And thank you so much for being my guest on One of a Kind.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
My guest on One of a Kind has been J. Patrick White, Johnson County Attorney. He retires in January 2007 after serving as county attorney for 24 years. Mr. White has influenced our community in many, many ways. Words used to describe my guest are dedicated, thoughtful, ethical, a leader focused on crime victims and their rights, public service oriented, and very smart. J. Patrick White is one of a kind.